when you hear about increasing activation, usually the goals around this are, if you can hit double-digit percentages, that's awesome. But today we get to hear an incredible story about how Matt and the team at Bonfire, using modern data tooling and their warehouse, increased activation rates by 80%. Incredible. When we heard this, we knew we had to tell the story. So let's dig in and start with some intros.
Cool. Yeah, I can maybe start with the first intro. So I'm Matt. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Bonfire. And I'll do a little introduction on Bonfire in just a second, but I'll pass it over to you, Tom.
All right. Thanks for having us on the show today, Eric. I head marketing at NetSpring. We're a warehouse data product analytics solution, and we uniquely bring the power of BI, or the modern flexibility and analytical power of that capability, to self-service product analytics in a self-service tool. And we are delighted to share Bonfire success using NetSpring today, but I will hand it over to Matt to dive right in.
Awesome. Yeah, and thanks for having me. So I'll start by just sharing a little bit more about Bonfire. So Bonfire is a Web3 enabled website builder for creators. So we help creators build custom branded sites where they can engage directly with their fans, and do so through things like membership passes, offering exclusive or early access to content, as well as creating one-of-a-kind drops and experiences. So for example, an artist who wants to give early sale or pre-sale tickets to their upcoming show, or the YouTuber who wants to offer additional exclusive content to their super fans. And then I think a big part of the power of Bonfire is that we're building on Web3 Rails. And so we can use things like NFTs as digital collectibles and membership passes to give creators the ability to have a much greater degree of ownership and autonomy over their communities. And so I can start by maybe just sharing a little bit more about the problem that we were facing about a year ago when we were looking for solutions in the data landscape. And so we started the company in May 2021. And at the end of 2022, we were running into this issue with our data and analytics, where essentially our data lived in two completely separate silos. And so we had our database data, which was a Postgres database, and we were using Mode as our analytics tool on top. And that gave us the ability to visualize and run analyses on our database data. But then separately, we had our event stream data, and we were using Amplitude to both capture and analyze that event data. And for us, event data would be like all of the just like micro actions and activity happening throughout the platform. So, user viewed this page, user clicked this button, and we kind of had very robust tracking of those events. But then when we got to the analysis phase, we were looking exclusively at that event data. And so while we had kind of two fairly robust systems of data, they were completely independent of one another, which made it really tough for us to get a clear picture of things like activation, retention, funnels, things that are like more complex and involve many actions a user might take throughout the product, because some of that data may live in event streams and some of it might live as being tracked in our database. And so not having the ability to like bring those two data sources together, not having the ability to actually like build a full picture across them was making it really hard for us to like get clarity on things like activation and retention. And so that's when we sort of identified that we needed a better solution and a better data stack.
Matt, one question on that's interesting. Was there sort of a Venn diagram of that data? Like, was there any crossover in what you were getting from Postgres and sort of, analyzing with a sort of, more of a traditional BI flow, and the sort of product data in Amplitude?
Yeah, so we kind of are a two-sided marketplace or platform in a way. So we serve creators, and then by extension, we help creators serve their fans.
Yep.
And so the types of data that we track in our database is mostly transactional. It's obviously more expensive to read and write to a database. So
Yep.
we'll track things like, a membership sale or a new claim of a reward. Whenever content is uploaded, we're tracking that via our database. Yep. But then the creator to fan engagement, so content streams, page views, like all of that data is all entirely in our event streams. So there was a place where it overlapped. So for example, for like audio uploaded, we both have a record in our database for that. And we also have an event that tracks that. But the source of truth would be the database data for something like that. But then the event data is what actually tells us like, how did that content perform? And so that was where like we couldn't connect the creator's action with the fan engagement on said action. And that kind of made it very difficult for us to tease apart something like, well, we hypothesize that fan engagement is a predictor of creator retention on Bonfire, but those two pieces of information actually live in kind of different systems.
Yeah. Super helpful. Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm always interested in like the specific pain points around those data silos. So thanks so much.
Totally. And yeah, so really we were looking for a unified data platform, and that's exactly what we got. And so through research, we uncovered the power duo of RudderStack and NetSpring. And then we began the process of migrating to a warehouse-centric data stack using RudderStack as kind of the data pipelines, and then having NetSpring that runs on top of our Snowflake warehouse to analyze all of this data in a like unified and more synthesized way. And so what we have today, single data warehouse, we have all of our database data flowing there. We have all of our event stream data flowing there via RudderStack. And then since kind of the initial setup, we also now have many other third-party data sources flowing into that warehouse via RudderStack's ETL products as well. So we have data from Google Analytics, Stripe, Intercom, kind of the whole ecosystem of SaaS tools that a startup is likely to adopt. We have all of that data flowing to the warehouse, and then we have NetSpring as kind of a single analytic solution that sits on top, allowing us to get like much richer insights from our repository of data. And so it's kind of the unified data platform is what we called it as the internal project name as we were like doing this migration. But I think what really surprised us was how easy it was to get set up. So we were able to use RudderStack to backfill all of our historical Amplitude data so that we didn't lose anything kind of in the migration, and then capture kind of all of our events going forward as well. And then connecting the database to Snowflake was also a breeze. And then getting NetSpring situated on top was also pretty seamless. And so kind of through this transition, we ended up in a world where we had a much simpler system and one that could do a lot more things for us. And so it's a lot more powerful, a lot more flexible. And I'll dive into some of the things we were able to achieve as a result right now.
One quick question on that, Matt, and I know I'm just thinking about our listeners who maybe are thinking about a backfill and maybe some differences in data schemas. Did you have to sort of adjust schemas when you did the backfill? Could you just maybe give a little bit more detail there for anyone who's interested in sort of migrating to a modern platform like this? But, backfill and migration are like, they can be scary words.
Totally. I will give a high level answer because my co-founder, Melissa, was the person who was doing the implementation, but I was in the RudderStack Slack Connect channel. So I, had a lot of context along the way. There was some minimal kind of transformations we needed to do just to make the process work. But really we had a RudderStack solutions engineer that helped us along the way. And it probably, it was a couple calls and a few days of work just to like get the scripts kind of in order to do those transformations. But really it wasn't much of an issue. And in terms of the actual like instrumentation on the event side, we mostly wanted the same events. And so it was largely like, Command F in our code base and just swap in the RudderStack API call instead of the Amplitude one. And so that part was very simple to kind of get the actual like going forward migration in place. The backfill took a little bit longer, but really wasn't a huge challenge by any means.
Yeah, super interesting. We love our transformations feature that sort of operates on the payloads as they're flowing through the system. We see that all the time when you're doing a backfill. You can just write the transformation that, updates the schema. And then when you backfill all of your events, they land in the warehouse, with the correct schema. So very cool that you guys kind of use that feature. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So just to kind of recap and summarize, so we moved from a world where we had sort of data living in two separate silos. So we got kind of incomplete pictures on both sides of the equation. So both in terms of like fan engagement, as well as like creator engagement with the Bonfire platform. And we were able to kind of move to this system where now we had all of that data living in a single source of truth and a analytics tool on top that allowed us to extract insights and learn from that data in a way that was much more robust. And actually just like a kind of funny consequence of this migration was also that by having all the data live in one place, like what was available to us or what was possible, like increased, or an order of magnitude. And so we actually started to track a lot more events because now being able to connect that back to, various tables in our database, like now having like a way to create more robust funnels and, behavioral cohorts, like there was actually like benefits to us building out our just like events library. So step one was kind of the migration. And then very quickly we got a lot more hungry when it came to events because of like what we could do with that data. And yeah, so I'll dive into some business outcomes. So I think, the biggest thing was just a, much cleaner single source of truth for all of our data. I've kind of talked about that. By eliminating the silos, it gave us a lot greater visibility and clarity around our data and what users were doing in the product. And so it lets us run more sophisticated analyses. It also lets us run the same analyses, but with better data powering them and such that we're getting better insights out of it. Garbage in, garbage out is what they say. And so having like all the data living in the same place means that like, even for the exact same analysis, we're going to get more insight. And so extracting higher quality insights and that I think is also, ultimately the business outcome is that allows us to drive those metrics because it allows us to like understand what's happening, build hypotheses around that, and then target those hypotheses with projects. And so, actually last thing I forgot to mention, or maybe I mentioned it quickly at the beginning, but we sort of started with the ambition of just getting our existing data stack into this new model. But since we've definitely gotten more ambitious with the types of things we want to learn, the product's expanded. And so, our intercom data and our Stripe data and our Google Analytics data, those also before lived in separate silos that we would go to those products and, look at the dashboards they provide. But now we also have all of that data flowing into Snowflake such that we're actually able to join those tables on data sets, in our database and event stream. And it kind of just continues to build out the picture of what users are doing in the product. And yeah, so then I think, really this started from a need to better understand activation and retention in our product. Those are two of our most important business metrics. And these were things that, as soon as we were able to have that increased clarity, it started to give us ideas on how we could improve those metrics. And so, on the activation side, we were able to much more clearly now see events that were early in a creator's journey on Bonfire that were correlated with long-term retention. And so we were able to refine our activation metric and then start driving improvements against that. And so in the 10 months or so since kind of the migration, we've seen over an 80% lift in terms of just our overall activation rate. And then similarly on the retention side, we were able to solve a lot of the gaps that we had before, such that we could see retention a lot more clearly. We could also like cut retention by like different views, different segments, a lot more cleanly. And we've seen retention nearly double over both our 4-week and 8-week retention. So we care about kind of different time frames. But we're seeing retention improve strongly, and I would really credit that to the ability to see what was going on in the platform, find those like things that correlate strongly with retention, and then really focus and hone in on those. And then I think lastly, I've become definitely a power user of NetSpring and have been like slowly learning all of the different capabilities that it offers. And so things like building advanced behavioral cohorts based on some sequence of events a user takes in our product, or properties or attributes of a user combined with events that they take. That's definitely something we look at a lot in order to basically understand, are there certain types of users that are performing best? Are there certain events that are most important to get a user to take early in the life, their life cycle on the product? And then how do those things, drive long-term results in terms of retention? And then, just to show some historical charts. So this data is from a little while ago, but just wanted to give a sense of kind of what the NetSpring product looks like, and what some of the trends that we were able to see were. And so I think what you're looking at right now is a 12-week retention chart of creators, and you're looking at a few different segments. These are some of our most essential segments that we're consistently tracking. And so you've got all creators as kind of the baseline. We target a few creator verticals, at least at this stage. And so musicians are our number one focus in terms of creator vertical. And so we segment by musicians to see, how are they performing against the baseline. And then we also, because we function as a website builder, creators can create a custom domain. We had a hypothesis that when a creator creates or adds a custom domain to their site, it increases their level of investment, and therefore their retention results. So we think that a creator who is investing more in the product, it feels more like their site, because they have a custom domain they can send people to, would perform better. And we certainly saw that in the data very clearly. And then last is pro creators. So pro is our premium subscription offering. And we also, had a hypothesis that creators paying for the platform would be retaining more highly. And that's also, very clearly true. But by being able to segment by each of those different types of users, it also allowed us to focus on specific ones. So obviously we pay special attention to the pro segment, because those are revenue generating creators for the platform. But we also care a lot about the baseline, and we care a lot about, our target vertical. So it just gives us a lot more granularity in terms of understanding what different users are doing on the platform, and then understanding our trends when it comes to things like retention.
And Matt, one question there, I see the sort of the retention condition on creator active events. So I'm guessing there are multiple events that you're tracking in the platform that sort of represent those that represent activation, right? So that in a way, this is sort of a way to create a semantic, a group of events that sort of represent semantically activation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And because there's several features in the platform, really at this point in time, what we are most interested in is what should our activation rate metric be? And we want to pick an activation rate metric that is highly correlated with long-term retention. So this was a hypothesis-driven kind of definition. But the other thing that we did a lot then, and are actually doing pretty consistently, is testing it against different definitions of activation to see if we find stronger correlations.
Yep.
Because ultimately, like what we want is an activation rate metric, like an aha moment that
Yep.
we know is, going to lead to long-term retention. And so we kind of have one definition that we use to track our own progress, but then we're constantly like running, counterfactuals against other definitions to see if those have higher correlations, and then, update that metric as we go.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point about the power of building around the data warehouse, is that, it's the classic, it's cliche at this point, but, one of the hardest questions to answer in a company is, what's an active user, right? You ask different people and they give you different answers. But I think it's such a good point that in many scenarios, you need to actually look at that in different ways to determine what the answer is. And so the ability to actually run multiple retention scenarios with different definitions is that's just incredible. So very, very cool.
Yeah, it blew my mind too. And it's something that I think has been like immensely valuable to us in terms of like validating our own hypotheses and giving us new hypotheses that we can both validate in the data and as well with the projects that we're putting on our roadmap.
Yeah. And then one other thing that I wanted to ask about that I think is really interesting. You have intercom data coming into, into the warehouse. And so intercom, for those who aren't familiar, is a platform that allows you to communicate with your users, right? So you send messages, send emails, and other, and it does a number of things. But Matt, I'm interested in that as a part of, are you including that data in the analysis? Because a lot of times what you see is you'll have sort of product usage data, and that's where things stop. But in reality, these customer communication platforms are sending messages. Those are additional touch points on the customer journey that happen outside, many times, sort of outside of the context of behavior in the app. Are you layering that in? Because I think that's such a powerful way to see how those messages are influencing retention, but so few companies ever actually complete that loop.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we use intercom data for a variety of things. It's not baked into our activation rate or retention metrics, but it is something that we use to run like ad hoc analyses. So how does a user who has a support ticket, and we can even look at, resolved versus like kind of went unanswered. Like how does that actually influence their long-term retention or engagement after that point? And we use intercom for outbound emails as well in certain cases. And so those are kind of, those batch emails have a batch send ID, and we can also tie that back to a user ID. And so, yeah, we're able to like build this full picture of how someone engages kind of within this, our sphere of influence, which includes the product, but also includes, third-party services that are interfacing with users.
Super cool.
Yeah. And then, so moving on to another really interesting analysis that we were able to run in NetSpring. And so what you're looking at right now is essentially an array of events in the platform with a correlation to long-term retention. And so this is, the actual events may not mean a ton without having a lot of context on the product, but we can see essentially like a stack ranked list of, 4 different events that a user took. We define the criteria in this case as a user triggered this event 2 or more times in the first 2 weeks of onboarding. And then we can see then like the correlation of that action of taking that event twice or more with long-term retention, which we define in this case as 8-week retention. And so this actually was a really essential part of how we kind of defined our activation metric, because for some of these events, like there might be something that kind of disqualifies it, for example, like sign up or like onboarding completed, like those are things every user is going to do. But for some of these, like they're features that are part of our core value proposition, and we could actually validate that when users like leverage these features within the first, few days of using the platform, that has at least correlation, obviously not causation, but correlation with long-term retention. And so this kind of was a almost like a guide for how we should think about activation. And we're actually in the process right now of like rerunning an analysis like this to see kind of, any of the features that we built over the last couple of quarters. Like, do we see any of those appear on this stack rank list? Do we see like any trends kind of in this correlation that may mean it's time to update our activation metric? And then finally, this is an acquisition path analysis. So this is the way that we kind of use this is we look at the events that precede a new user sign up. And so it kind of gives us this visual, descriptor of like what events are a user taking prior to them signing up. And so you can see that, one of them is user mints an NFT. And so that actually was in line with the hypothesis we had, which is that because creators are using Bonfire to build their own site, and then they're promoting that site on other platforms. So they might be promoting it, to their fan base on Instagram or Twitter or in a Discord. They're then driving traffic to that site. And amongst the traffic are other potential creators or customers of Bonfire. And we could actually see that, somebody engaging on one of our creator sites is likely to then lead them to at least inquire and check out Bonfire and potentially onboard and sign up themselves. And so this was just able to kind of give us both like, what are the top events in terms of driving acquisition, or at least the top events that precede acquisition. And then also like the magnitude of those. So, you can see that certain events are actually happening at a much greater frequency than others. And then we could kind of fine tune like which events are we considering in the analysis. For some of these events, it's like they have to proceed onboarding. So we kind of filtered those out and looked at just the ones that we had a strong hypothesis might be predictive of, future acquisition. And so this is just another kind of illustrative example of like what we're able to use NetSpring to do now that all of that data lives in a single place. And yeah, that is really like what I had to share. Thanks so much for having me. And I know there's Q&A coming up next, but if you want to get in touch, I'm Matt Alston, email matt@bonfire.xyz, and would love to hear from you.
All right. Well, I think we have a little bit of time for a couple of questions. So let's see what's here coming down the wire. Okay, this is an interesting one. When we think about transactions from the Postgres database, this is a great question about that. Are you using NetSpring or RudderStack to convert those transactions from the Postgres database into events? Which is I think it's a great question because technically they are events. How are you sort of treating that?
Yeah, so we do that all the time. In fact, so in our database tables, in many of our database tables, we have a created at timestamp. And that's how we were tracking via database, like when a user signs up. Or we also have creators since, because a lot of creators start as a fan of another creator site. So we can also have that timestamp of when they converted into a creator. And then, yeah, we basically use that timestamp to model an event stream in NetSpring. And that is like a way that we can then start combining or treating kind of like all of our data as streams, which just makes it way more powerful kind of within the NetSpring product.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay, question about migration, which is one of those, potentially scary words that we talked about. How long did it actually take you to migrate off of Amplitude and get up and running with RudderStack and NetSpring on Snowflake?
So yeah, so all in, we had one of our developers working on this, and I would say the total time frame was within about 2 weeks, I want to say.
Wow.
This wasn't 2 weeks of dedicated work, though. It was the backfill, I think, was the the actual instrumentation piece was probably a few days. The backfill, there was also some lead time while we were like,
Sure.
scheduling a call with solutions
Yep.
engineer and whatnot. But yeah, to get to kind of just like the point where we had all of the data like in Snowflake, less than 2 weeks, and that was a little less than one engineer's time with some breaks in between.
And then this same attendee had a follow-up question on sort of ramp up time for business users in NetSpring, right? Because there's obviously the infrastructure piece of it, which you just talked about. But there's also a migration for the end users of the platform who are not necessarily the data people. So can you talk about sort of that migration and the ramp up time in NetSpring?
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I forgot to mention about the migration time is that it was definitely made possible by all the support we got from the RudderStack team, and I would say the same is true for the end user ramp up time on NetSpring. NetSpring team has been super helpful at getting us onboarded, answering questions quickly, etc. So I would say, I wasn't a very sophisticated data user when we were back on like Amplitude mode. And so I think the first thing is that I was coming from kind of a, low knowledge baseline, relatively speaking. And the first thing that I did was just like learn how to recreate the same analyses, but really the main motivation for moving was that we could run those analyses on a combined data set. And so that was kind of like my first project, was like getting back to parity, but on a better, data source of truth. And that, I mean, maybe a couple of weeks then, but that was actually before NetSpring had shipped the templates that now I pretty much exclusively rely on for things like retention. And so that was, being built in more custom ways. But now there's templates for retention, for event segmentation, for funnels. So I imagine it would be, dramatically reduced in today's world. But then I would say the next phase of my experience on NetSpring was like realizing all of the new capabilities that we could do because of A, having all this data living in single source of truth, and B, because I was becoming a more sophisticated data user. And the kind of block system that NetSpring uses makes it very easy to essentially build complex queries, but in a very kind of intuitive, drag and click and way. And you can like combine blocks in this very modular format. And so I don't write SQL at all in NetSpring, but I can build very like complex analyses just based on common sense and like using the tools available. And so the next phase was me like just coming up with questions that I wanted answered of our data, and then seeing if I could build it in NetSpring. And I would say like I'm getting constantly more sophisticated there. So I would say like the initial ramp up was, a couple of weeks, but I think the ceiling is just so much higher that it's kind of become now like a pet project of mine. It's like getting more and more like sophisticated and like trying to answer more complex questions, because I think it's just, there's so much value that's like locked away in our data, and like getting it out is the hard part. And, now that we've got the data stack to support it, I'm trying to make sure I have the expertise to actually like, capitalize.
Yeah, that's great. So another question in that same vein that just came up, which I think is a great follow-up question, is, thinking about sort of, and I think it's a great follow-up question because you mentioned a higher ceiling. You had talked about advanced behavioral cohorts in NetSpring. Amplitude, which is the tool that you migrated off of, has similar functionality. Are there can you dig into what does that higher ceiling mean? If sort of both tools on face value can do something similar from that standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that by having the multiple data sources all living in the same place, we are able to actually like pull together things that before like we just couldn't. And so part of it comes from like our ability to see how fan engagement around a creator site like results in creator engagement with Bonfire. Like those kind of were in two silos before. And so like some of the behavioral cohorts we could build were like naturally limited by just some of the lack of connection between those data sources. And so like, for example, now we will often build, I kind of mentioned this before, but we'll build a behavioral cohort around like some specific sequence of actions that we want to observe. But also sometimes we'll play with that and we'll like, you know, come up with a few different variations or a few different hypotheses and then be able to like look at them side by side. And I have to admit, I'm a lot more familiar with NetSpring's offering than Amplitude. So I can't comment specifically on the comparison,
Sure.
but I think really like the big difference maker is the data that we have to run those cohorts on. So even like looking at, you know, somebody's journey from not being a user, being like a page visitor, you know, RudderStack will help us resolve that into a user ID when they sign up. Then we can actually like look at that journey through onboarding, activation, like their use of the platform, and even like their community's use of their platform as their site, and kind of like stitch all of that together, which was something we could never really do before.
Yep, that's super helpful. And that's why you build with a warehouse native approach, right?
Yeah.
Which is super exciting. Okay, we have time for one last question. And this is, I think, probably a little bit more of a question, Tom, for you and me. Someone said, you know, you have Snowflake, but do RudderStack and NetSpring work on other data infrastructure? So, Tom, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'll give the NetSpring answer here. And great question. So while we are a Snowflake connected app, any cloud data warehouse is supported for direct query and computation. So we're also BigQuery ready. We're also supporting Databricks and AWS Redshift.
Yep, and similar on the RudderStack side, you know, and even if you want to, you know, if we think about sort of the analytical databases, you know, we support all the major players there, multiple data lakes as well, and even some production databases like Postgres. So being the pipeline that gets the data in there, we can sort of service any kind of infrastructure. Well, that's all the time we have for questions. Matt, incredible story. Congrats on the success, and we wish you even more success in the future as you uncover insights with your warehouse native stack.
Yes, thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for you know, the products that we rely on.